The Obama administration is developing plans right now to ease travel restrictions to Cuba. This hasn't been announced yet, but it could happen very soon. And we have a sneak peek for you tonight on Rick's List. A senior U.S. official and congressional sources tell CNN the new policy would allow academics, corporations, humanitarian groups, and probably most sports teams to travel to Cuba. The goal in all this is to increase people-to-people exchanges. It would also allow any American to send money to Cuba. Right now, it's only Cuban Americans who can do that. Now, this wouldn't lift the full Cuba travel ban for tourists or the trade embargo, but it would loosen the strict rules in place since the Bush administration. And this has a lot of people talking. And it's something Rick talked about with Ninoska Perez Castellon, host of Radio Mambi in Miami, and Tomas Bilbao, who is executive director of the Cuba Study Group and is in Madrid right now meeting with the political prisoners just released from Cuba.
This would not change the trade embargo, and American tourists could still seek visits. So why would you be opposed to this exchange that was established, what, during the Clinton administration, right?
Because this is exactly what the Clinton administration did, and the only response the Cuban regime had was downing civilian airplanes with American citizens on board in international airspace. So what has the Cuban regime done to merit the lifting of any sanctions? There has been no change in Cuba. Political prisoners that are freed have been sent into exile. Just now, 4 that were supposed to be released, one said that he would not leave Cuba, and he was sent back to prison. So what has the Cuban government done to earn the lifting of sanctions?
Mr. Bilbao, why is she wrong if she is?
Well, because what Ninoska is suggesting is that the United States, recognizing the right of its Americans to travel to Cuba and the important and positive impact that that has on Cuban civil society, is somehow a reward to the Cuban regime, when in fact Cuba's leading human rights advocates and dissidents inside the island have urged the U.S. government to go far beyond what the administration is proposing, and in fact called on the Congress to pass a bill that would lift the travel ban for all Americans. The policy of isolation that hasn't worked for the last 50 years, it's very clear, we're being told by dissidents inside Cuba that isolation only serves the purposes of the regime.
Let me ask
we should contribute to that isolation by adding restrictions with our own policy.
Let me bring Ninoska back into this conversation by asking her a question that people around the world ask all the time. Why is it, if the United States can have relations with Vietnam, with whom we were mortal enemies during the war, open relations with countries like China, despite the fact that they still have certainly communist leanings, if not still called a communist country, then why are we still stuck in our attitude of closed relations with Cuba, treating them still as if they are actively an enemy?
Why was it that when there was apartheid in South Africa, the embargo was not lifted until elections were held and the racist government ended? And it's the same with Cuba. The dissidents he's talking about signed a letter, which is unprecedented, because how do you explain that the people who are being repressed are signing a petition to lift sanctions on those who are repressing them? A letter which most people say came from the Cuba Study Group. So what is the explanation that Castro still repressing Cuba?
Mr. Bilbao, she's right. There are still plenty of cases and evidence that there are people in Cuba who are being mistreated simply for what they believe or think, being treated as political prisoners. And we've seen the roundups in the past. We've seen the abuses with the rapid response brigades. But I believe that the argument that you need to make, or are making, is that by opening up Cuba, we would work to rid Cuba of that. Is that right? Could you explain us how that would work?
Well, Rick, it's not the argument that I'm making. This is the argument that the democracy advocates inside Cuba, the very people who are being repressed by the Cuban regime, are making. And they're telling us that by contributing to the isolation that the Cuban government has imposed on the Cuban people, we're only delaying the processes of change inside the island. So while Ninoska may not like the fact that dissidents inside the island have voiced support for the lifting of the travel restrictions, that doesn't mean that that's not a fact, and that and I'm glad, by the way, that Ninoska brought up South Africa, because the United States had no travel restrictions to South Africa, In fact, it had no travel restrictions to the Soviet Union after Ronald Reagan, of all people, who no one would accuse of being soft on communism, lifted the travel ban to the Soviet Union because he believed that the contact that American citizens can have with closed societies is beneficial for the process of change. And that's the same argument that democracy advocates are making inside Cuba.
Tomas Bilbao, Ninoska, Perez, thank you so much. We appreciate your time taking us through this argument. My thanks to both of you.